What is Carl Jung's relationship to Gnosticism? This is the 14th in my series on Gnosticism for today. And because I was too rushed and lazy to put on a proper shirt and tie this correctly, I'll just hold up what it has on it. This tie was given to me some years ago. It's hand painted, and it's got this great image out of Carl Jung's Red Book, which record some of his active imaginations in middle age, some of the fantasies that came bubbling up, some of the dreams. And the Red Book is packed with Gnostic themes. Lance Owen talks about this in some of his work, by the way. So Jung and Gnosticism, his relationship to it actually goes back to childhood, when he had a dream of a giant penis sitting on a throne underground. Jung always did have colorful dreams. And in the dream, his mother calls out in alarm, "It's the man-eater." So I haven't heard any Jungians talk about what she meant by that. I mean, a couple of them have talked about her saying that, but in a Gnostic connection, so man-eater is one of the names of the Gnostic demiurge, who creates the world and who is sometimes evil, sometimes good. So Gnostic themes show up for Jung all through his life. And during that confrontation with the unconscious he had in middle age, the material that came up, which he at first wrote in his Black Book journals, which I teach a class on at Jung Platform, by the way. It's a tour of the Black Books. And then the Red Book excerpt, just packed with Gnostic imagery. I think that getting in touch with that imagery actually helped save Jung's sanity and put him back on his feet. Because as he did with his later patients, it showed him that the images, the promptings, the impulses and the nightmares that he thought were so bizarre actually are part of a very long spiritual tradition. And that had a healing effect on him. He was able to stand all that. So some years ago, I wrote a paper called Gnostic Antecedents of Jungian Psychology, I think it was. And at that point, I had studied Gnosticism, read everything that's been translated into English. I was teaching it, and I argued that Jung's version of depth psychology is basically Gnosticism moved forward, updated, with some other things thrown in. And I took it to some scholars who specialize in Jung's relationship to Gnosticism, and I said, prove me wrong. And they couldn't. They didn't like it, but they couldn't prove me wrong. So it just kind of sat for a while, and then the scholar Sonu Shamdasani dug up a letter that Jung had written. And in the letter, Jung says that the basis of his version of depth psychology basically has to be Gnosticism with some Neoplatonism. And I went there, yep, of course it is, right? So one way this looks for Jung, he does cite the Gnostics in his writings, but I don't think enough. One way this looks is in his Black Books when he's talking to various Gnostic gods and goddesses, one of whom is Sophia. And he calls her soul a lot. And at one point he calls her anima, which is a psychological term for the feminine component of a man's mind. And she doesn't like that. She says, "Do you know who I am?" I'm not sure he ever really did. But if you know about Sophia's Gnostic myths and you read Jung's journals, you can see her presence in them pretty clearly. He learned a lot from her. So I like this image of Jung being kind of mentored on the inside through imagination by Sophia herself. I think that she was his most persistent guide. And the Jung books stretch over 19 years. So there was a lot going on there. So one thing we can take away from this that I think is useful is the idea that there are ancient traditions and myths that can be, as Jung would have put it, dreamed onward by giving them a modern dress. He says that in Psychology and Alchemy. We can take these wisdoms, these old insights, and instead of just worshiping the containers they come in, which is the usual mistake, especially by esoteric societies, we can instead use mythopoetics, in other words, myth-making, to give them new settings, new context, new stories. And it seems like our time really needs that.